Everyone tells you dating apps are broken. That's not the real problem. The real problem is you and the pattern you keep repeating without noticing it. Here's what's strange. Logan Ury didn't write this book as a matchmaker, guessing at what works. She wrote it as a behavioral economist who used to run experiments for Google on how people make decisions, and then went and ran the same kind of experiments on dating. She found 3 patterns: the maximizer, who keeps swiping because someone better might be one profile away; the romanticizer, who's waiting for a lightning bolt that was never coming; and the hesitator, who says, I'll date once I've lost the weight, once I've got the job, once I feel ready. Ready never comes. That's the whole trick of it. So here's the question for you before we even start. Which one are you? Because by the end of this, you're going to know, and you're not going to like the answer. It's an incredibly uncomfortable mirror to hold up, realizing you might actually be the architect of your own dating misery. But we are absolutely not here to judge you today. Human biology sets a trap for all of us, and today we're going to dismantle that trap piece by piece. We're pulling heavily from Logan Ury's book, How to Not Die Alone, alongside a massive stack of behavioral science research and interviews. Because the mission today is to take behavioral economics, the exact same field of science that explains why we buy things we don't need, or why we stubbornly hold on to losing stocks in a portfolio, and apply it directly to your love life. We want to expose the hidden blind spots that are actively sabotaging your search for a partner. It's about pulling back the curtain on the predictably irrational ways our brains malfunction when confronted with modern romance, and giving you a scientifically backed toolkit to override those glitches. But to really understand why this framework is so powerful, we have to talk about who Logan Ury actually is. Let's unpack this, because almost nobody mentions her actual origin story when covering this book. They just treat her like another dating coach. But she isn't just someone who decided to start handing out internet dating advice. She studied psychology at Harvard. Then she went to Google, and she worked on what's called people analytics, which is a fascinating field. Let's define what people analytics actually means in a corporate environment like Google, because it sets the stage for everything we're about to discuss. It's basically the practice of applying behavioral science to how employees make decisions at work. For instance, behavioral economists study why a hiring manager might look at 2 identical resumes and choose the candidate who went to their own alma mater, completely ignoring the objective skill metrics because of built-in biases. They study the cognitive biases that cause us to make irrational, suboptimal choices, while genuinely believing, truly believing, we're being perfectly logical. She also worked in a much more sensitive corner of Google's research, analyzing private search behavior, basically looking at the raw data of what people actually desire versus what they claim to desire in public, which is always a massive gap. But then she left. Not for another massive tech job, which is what you'd expect. She opened a life coaching practice built entirely around dating because she noticed the exact same irrational patterns showing up in her single friends' love lives that she had been studying in workplace economics. And honestly, the transition makes perfect sense when you look at the underlying mechanics of it. The poor decision-making patterns that cause a manager to make a terrible hire are the exact same neurological patterns causing someone to swipe left on a phenomenal potential life partner. It's the same brain. Human beings are, as behavioral scientist Dan Ariely famously put it, predictably irrational. Whether you're evaluating a spreadsheet, a mutual fund, or a dating profile, your brain is just taking the same lazy shortcuts. And that's when Hinge hired her. But they didn't bring her on as a marketer or a PR spokesperson. They hired her as their director of relationship science, a very specific data-heavy role. So when this book talks about data, it's not just vibes. It's coming from someone who has literally looked at how millions of people swipe, how they message, how they self-sabotage, and built a framework out of the wreckage. And that matters so much, because it means this isn't a self-help book dressed up in science language. It's much closer to Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, except the subject is your love life instead of your wallet. What's fascinating here is Ury's central thesis, which fundamentally rejects the narrative we've been sold for the last century. Her core argument is actually super simple. Great relationships aren't something that just happens to you. They don't strike you like a lightning bolt out of a clear blue sky while you're, reaching for the same apple at a grocery store. The classic rom-com meet cute. They are built, on purpose, through a series of intentional decisions, and most people never get there because they're stuck in one of 3 behavioral patterns, all defined by wildly unrealistic expectations. The maximizer treats dating like online shopping. You have this constant, nagging feeling that there's always a better option in the next tab, so nothing ever feels quite good enough to commit to. The maximizer suffers from unrealistic expectations of their partner. And to really understand the maximizer, we have to look at the cognitive load of decision-making. In behavioral science, we talk about something called the fear of making the wrong decision. That perfectly describes it. The maximizer operates under the delusion that if they just do enough research, if they just turn over one more stone, they'll find the objectively perfect answer. They imagine they can build this Frankenstein partner, taking pieces of everyone. They think, well, I like this person's ambition, but I want the spontaneous travel habits of my last ex, and I want the physical fitness of that person I saw at the coffee shop today, which is just a mathematical impossibility. You're essentially trying to compile a human being from a checklist of disparate traits. It doesn't exist in nature. But let's say you aren't swiping endlessly. Let's say you're holding out for destiny. That makes you the romanticizer, the dreamer. The romanticizer believes in the one, in soulmates, in a spark so violent and obvious that you won't even need to think about it. Unlike the maximizer, who expects a perfect partner, the romanticizer has unrealistic expectations of relationships themselves. Psychologists frame this as the soulmate mindset versus the work-it-out mindset. And that media paints a very specific, highly flawed picture. It tells us the hard part of love is simply finding the person. According to Hollywood, once you slay the dragon or have that perfect meet cute, everything after that is a montage of easy bliss. The credits roll, and you're done. So when a romanticizer inevitably gets into a normal, mundane fight with their partner about whose turn it is to take out the trash, their brain panics. Their internal narrative goes, oh, this feels like work. Soulmates don't have to work at it, therefore this must not be the one. So they bail the second they encounter normal human friction. It's wild. And then we have the third pattern, the hesitator. If you're a hesitator, you keep waiting for some future version of yourself, the one with the better job, the cleaner apartment, the one who's finally lost 10 pounds, who's finally allowed to date. They have unrealistic expectations of themselves. It's like refusing to let anyone inside your house until the $1 million kitchen renovation is perfectly finished. But you haven't even gone to the hardware store to buy the lumber yet. In behavioral economics, we call this the intention-action gap. It's the psychological chasm between intending to do something and actually taking the physical steps to do it. The hesitator genuinely wants love, but they're terrified of the vulnerability required right now in their current imperfect state. But the brutal truth of relationship science is that the only way to get better at dating is by actually dating. You cannot learn how to swim by sitting on your couch reading a textbook about fluid dynamics. You've got to get in the water. You have to experience the friction of interaction and learn what you actually need through trial and error. But here's the part that really stings, the blind spot. None of these people, not the maximizer, not the romanticizer, not the hesitator, think they're doing anything wrong. That's exactly what makes a pattern a pattern. You just don't see it from the inside. You just think you're being reasonable, or hopelessly romantic, or appropriately careful. And if you're relying on dating apps to help you break these patterns, you're in for a massive shock. Which brings us to the angle almost nobody covers, and it's arguably the most useful, revelatory thing in the entire book. Ury doesn't just diagnose your tendency. She points out quietly but clearly that the apps she used to help design are engineered around exactly these weaknesses. So the tools you're using to fix the problem are structurally reinforcing the problem. Ury never quite says the apps are the villain. She still works in that world, but the mechanism she describes is basically a confession. She names the exact same biases Kahneman mapped for money decisions, loss aversion, the paradox of choice, decision fatigue, and shows you they're running your dating life the same way. So let's look at the mechanics of this, starting with the maximizer, because the app is basically a digital casino. Endless swiping rewards the maximizer's brain with the exact same variable reward loop that B.F. Skinner discovered in his famous operant conditioning experiments with pigeons. Here's how that works. Skinner put pigeons in a box with a lever. In one scenario, the pigeon presses the lever and gets a food pellet every single time. That's a fixed reward. The pigeon learns the rule, eats until it's full, and stops pulling the lever. Boring. But in the second scenario, Skinner changed the rules. The pigeon presses the lever, and sometimes it gets a pellet, sometimes it gets nothing, sometimes it gets 3 pellets, a variable reward. And the pigeons lost their minds. They pressed the lever obsessively, endlessly, addicted not to the food, but to the unpredictability of the reward. That is exactly what a dating app interface is. You swipe left, nothing. Swipe right, nothing. Swipe right, a match. You get the dopamine hit of the pellet. It creates an addiction to the search itself, rather than the result. You aren't looking for a partner anymore. You're just pressing the lever, And for the Romanticizer, the apps are equally dangerous, but in a different way, because they feed the fantasy before a single word is even spoken. It's all visual highlights. Apps are highly curated visual environments. A Romanticizer looks at a profile, 3 perfectly lit photos, a witty prompt about loving tacos, and their brain immediately fills in all the missing gaps with idealized, perfect information. They construct a whole narrative. They fall in love with a ghost. It's a projection of their own desires, long before they've ever heard this person's voice or seen how they treat a waiter. And for the hesitator, the sheer size of the dating pool gives them one more rationalization to believe someone more ready compatible is still out there, waiting in the digital ether for them to finally get that promotion or lose that weight. The app gives them the illusion of forward momentum. They're looking at profiles. They're active. But it doesn't require a single ounce of actual vulnerability. To understand why this environment is so toxic to human connection, we have to look at a behavioral concept called relationship shopping. Dating apps fundamentally force us to treat human beings as searchable goods. Think about buying a digital camera or a television. You can compare megapixels, screen size, battery life, price. Those are searchable goods. But human beings are experience goods, like a fine wine or an intricate movie. You cannot put human chemistry on a spreadsheet. You cannot evaluate the quality of an experience good by looking at a spec sheet. You have to experience it in real time to know how it makes you feel. But the apps force us into evaluating people like we're shopping for electronics, which leads perfectly into a concept called evaluability. Think about buying a laptop. You don't really know what 16 gigs of RAM means for your daily life. You just type documents and watch videos. You probably don't need it. But because 16 is a bigger number than 8, and it's sitting right there on the screen side by side, you assume it's vastly superior, and you end up paying more for it. That's exactly what we're doing to human beings on these apps. Evaluability means metrics seem disproportionately important to our brains simply because they're measurable. Ury points to a staggering statistic in the data about height and income. On a dating app, a man who is 5'8" supposedly needs to make $40,000 more a year to be considered as desirable as a man who is 5'9", $40,000 for 1 inch of height. That's absolute insanity. It's entirely irrational, but it perfectly illustrates the flaw of the interface. When you put numbers side by side on a screen, height, income, age, distance, our brains latch onto those metrics because they're easy to compare, just like the RAM on your laptop. If you met that 5'8" man at a dinner party and had blazing, undeniable chemistry, your brain would not be calculating the 1 inch difference in height. You wouldn't even notice. But on an app, the measurable trait becomes the mandatory trait. What's measured is what matters, at least to our irrational brains. And there are just too many metrics and too many profiles, which brings us to one of the most famous behavioral economics studies of all time, the JAM study by Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper. This completely changes how you should view the sheer volume of dating apps. Here's the scene. Iyengar and Lepper went to an upscale grocery store, Draeger's Market in California, and set up a tasting booth displaying Wilkin & Sons jams. On one day, they offered a massive display of 24 different varieties of jam. On another day, they offered a modest display of only 6 jams. The results completely upended traditional economic theory, because traditional theory says more choices are always better for the consumer. But when they had 24 jams, tons of people stopped to look. It was a spectacle. When it came time to actually buy a jar, though, almost no one bought anything. They were paralyzed. The cognitive load of trying to calculate which of the 24 jams was the absolute best was so exhausting that their brains just gave up and they walked away. But when they offered just 6 jams, people felt confident. They could manage the variables, pick one they liked, and make a purchase. That's the paradox of choice in a nutshell. Now apply that to modern romance. The apps don't give you 6 jams. They give you 24,000 jams in your zip code alone. You're constantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of hypothetical options, which paralyzes your ability to make a single confident choice. But there's another psychological layer that makes the app environment even more treacherous. Ury calls it the Monet Effect. Yes, like the French Impressionist painter Claude Monet. Think about standing in a museum looking at a Monet painting from 20 feet away. It looks like a beautiful, cohesive, serene landscape of water lilies. But when you walk right up to the canvas, your perspective shifts entirely. You realize it's just a chaotic, messy, disjointed arrangement of little colored dots. It's all an illusion. On a dating app, a person's profile is the painting from 20 feet away. They look perfect. Your brain fills in the blurry spots with positive assumptions because you're naturally inclined to want this to work out. But then you meet them in real life for a drink. You get up close, you see the dots. You notice they have a weird honking laugh, or they chew with their mouth open, or they're rude to the bartender. They're a flawed, 3-dimensional human being. And because the apps encouraged you to build a flawless fantasy in your head over 3 weeks of text back and forth, the actual breathing human sitting across from you at the bar can never, ever compete with the imaginary version you constructed. The real person is always going to lose to the ghost. It's bleak when you lay it out like that. We're paralyzed by choice, evaluating human beings like laptops, comparing real people to imaginary ghosts. But Ury connects all of these app behaviors to something much deeper, something rooted in our earliest childhood development. She cross-maps the 3 dating tendencies directly to attachment theory, and it really is the underlying operating system running these behaviors. Most breakdowns of this book treat attachment theory as its own separate section, a sort of side note. It's actually the foundational code. To understand it, we have to look back at Mary Ainsworth's famous strange situation experiments from the 1970s. Ainsworth brought infants and their mothers into a room filled with toys. Then she had the mother leave the room, leaving the baby with a stranger, and eventually the mother would return. Ainsworth painstakingly recorded how the babies reacted to the separation and the reunion. The reactions fell into distinct categories. Secure babies were upset when the mother left, but easily comforted when she returned. They felt safe exploring the toys. Anxious babies were inconsolable when the mother left, and when she returned, they were ambivalent, wanting to be held, but also pushing the mother away, angry that she had left at all. And avoidant babies, when the mother left, didn't cry. When she returned, they ignored her. They'd learned to suppress their emotional needs because they believed those needs wouldn't be reliably met. What's so profound is realizing those exact same wiring patterns from infancy, how we seek safety and connection, are running the show in your 30s when you're staring at a dating app at 11 at night. Ury points out that anxious attachment often shows up wearing the romanticizer's clothes. People with an anxious attachment style have an overactive threat response system when it comes to relationships. They crave intense, sometimes chaotic closeness to feel secure. They chase the dramatic sparks, the extreme highs and lows of the rom-com chase, because to them, that emotional turbulence feels like proof of love. Think about the physiological reaction of waiting for a text message from someone you just started dating, watching those 3 little typing bubbles appear, then disappear. An anxiously attached person experiences a literal spike in cortisol and adrenaline. If they aren't agonizing over a relationship, they don't think it's real chemistry. They fundamentally confuse the activation of their anxiety system with romantic passion. They mistake a panic attack for butterflies. Avoidant attachment often shows up as the hesitator, always finding a reason it isn't quite the right time. Because for the hesitator, distance feels safer than dependence. If you never actually enter the dating arena because you're endlessly working on yourself, you're perfectly insulated from the risk of rejection or the perceived suffocation of intimacy. It's a highly effective defense mechanism. The avoidant infant didn't look at the mother when she returned. The adult hesitator doesn't look at the dating pool. Both are avoiding the vulnerability of being truly seen. But Ury adds a twist worth sitting with. She says maximizers are often avoidant too, just in a different disguise. It sounds contradictory on the surface. Maximizers go on 4 dates a week. It's hard to argue that someone putting in that much physical effort is avoiding intimacy. But look at the mechanical outcome of their behavior. By keeping the door constantly open to better options, by perpetually swiping and searching, what is the maximizer actually achieving? They're staying busy, but they're also ensuring they never actually have to walk through one of those doors and deeply commit. Keeping the door open means never making a choice. Seeking perfection is the ultimate shield against intimacy, because perfection doesn't exist. You can go on 1,000 dates, but if your internal criteria are designed to find a flaw in every single person, you remain perfectly safe from the vulnerability of a real relationship. It's a subconscious strategy to push people away. The volume of dates is just a smokescreen. Ury tells a story in the book about a guy who wanted to break up with a woman because she pronounced the word pitcher like a pitcher of water in a way he didn't like. He justified it by claiming it showed a lack of education or refinement, a fundamental incompatibility. But the psychological reality, when Ury dug into it, was that his avoidant attachment system was desperate for an exit hatch because they were getting closer emotionally. His maximizing tendency simply provided the socially acceptable excuse to push her away. He wasn't really looking for the perfect partner. His subconscious was actively hunting for a flaw, any flaw, to justify maintaining his emotional distance. Here's where it gets really interesting though. We know the traps. We know the apps are rigged against our biology. We know our childhood attachment is sabotaging our swipes. So what's the actual antidote to this mess? The antidote requires a fundamental shift in how we process choices. We have to move from being a maximizer to what Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert called a Satisficer. Now, we need to be very clear here. because the word often triggers a negative reaction. Being a satisficer is not the same thing as settling. That's the immediate fear. If you tell me to satisfice, it sounds like you're telling me to give up on my dreams and settle for someone mediocre just so I don't die alone. It's a common misconception, but it's totally backwards. A satisficer actually sets a very high, rigorous, uncompromising benchmark for what they want and need in a partner. They aren't lowering standards. But, and this is the crucial difference, once they find an option that meets or exceeds that high benchmark, they commit to it and they stop looking. They close the tabs. They delete the apps. They don't wonder if there's someone 5% better waiting on the next swipe. Behavioral data shows us something fascinating about human happiness in the context of decision-making. Go back to the laptop analogy. A maximizer will spend 6 months researching every processor, reading every review, and they will objectively buy the best laptop on the market, but they'll feel terrible about their choice, plagued by regret, constantly checking tech blogs to see if a newer, slightly faster model just dropped. They're miserable. Satisficers, on the other hand, figure out what specs they need, find a laptop that hits those specs, buy it, and feel great about it. Long-term satisfaction doesn't come from the objective mathematical perfection of the choice. It comes from how you subjectively feel about the choice you made and your willingness to invest your energy into it instead of continuing the search. But how do you know when you've hit that benchmark in your love life? How do you know you aren't committing too early to the first person who comes along or waiting too long and missing all the good ones? This is where relationship science borrows from a famous mathematical riddle called the secretary problem, sometimes known as optimal stopping theory or the 37% rule. Here's the math. Imagine you have to interview 100 candidates for an executive secretary position. The rules are strict. You can only interview them one at a time, and once you reject a candidate, you cannot go back and hire them later. They're gone forever. If you hire too early, say, candidate number 3, you might miss the absolute best person waiting at number 80. But if you wait too long, always holding out for someone better, the best person might have already passed by, and you're left with no one. It's the ultimate fear of missing out. So what's the mathematically optimal strategy? Mathematicians ran the probabilities and found that the intersection of maximum data collection and maximum remaining options sits at exactly 37%. The optimal strategy is to interview the first 37 candidates, reject all of them, use the best of that group as your benchmark, and then hire the very next person who beats that benchmark. Reject them all, even if number 12 is amazing, because those first 37 candidates serve a specific, vital purpose: data collection. They teach you what the market looks like. You use the absolute best person from that initial 37% group as your baseline benchmark. Then you continue interviewing candidate 38, 39, 40. The very next person you meet who's equal to or better than your benchmark is the one you hire immediately. Let's map this onto a human lifespan of dating. Say you plan to actively date between the ages of 18 and 40. That's a 22-year window. The 37% mark of a 22-year window is roughly 8 years. 18 plus 8, by age 26, you hit your 37% mark. By 26, you've likely dated enough people to establish your benchmark. You know what's out there. You know what kind of crazy you can tolerate and what you can't. The very next person you meet after age 26, who's as good as or better than the best person you dated in your early 20s, that's a person you should invest in. The math suggests you already have enough data. You don't need to keep researching until you're 35. You aren't settling. You're acting on optimal stopping theory. But to actually execute this, to shift from maximizing to satisficing, you have to actively change the environment in which you're making decisions. You have to shift from evaluative dating, staring at metrics on a screen, to experiential dating. And Ury gives some genuinely practical, tactical advice on how to force this shift. First, she says you have to fight the status quo bias by actively expanding your app filters. If you only date people 5'10" and above, drop it to 5'8". If you only date within a 5-mile radius, expand it to 15. Force the algorithm to show you people who break your rigid, untested assumptions. Second, she says you have to fight the Monet Effect by getting off the app and meeting up sooner. Stop being pen pals for a month, building up a massive fantasy that no real human can live up to. Meet for coffee in 3 days. See the real dots. Third, to fight the paradox of choice, the jam study paralysis, you must date fewer people at once. If you go to the jam tasting table and try all 24 jams, you'll leave with a stomachache and empty hands. If you're messaging 15 people on an app, you're treating them like a deck of trading cards, not human beings. Limit yourself to engaging with 3 people at a time. It forces you to actually evaluate the experience of talking to them rather than chasing the dopamine hit of matching with someone new. So say you do all this. You expand the filters, you meet up quickly, you satisfice using the 37% rule, and you find someone great. Are we done? Do you ride off into the sunset? Of course not. Because now we have to talk about prom dates, oncology wards, and knowing when to fold. This is the crucial pivot in Ury's framework. We transition from the science of finding a partner to the behavioral science of choosing a partner for the long haul. And the biggest cognitive hurdle in mate selection is a concept called present bias, sometimes known as hyperbolic discounting. It's our neurological tendency to heavily overvalue the here and now, the immediate hedonic pleasure, and severely undervalue future consequences or future stability. It's the psychological mechanism that explains why we eat the entire chocolate cake today and swear we'll start the diet tomorrow. Our brains are hardwired for instant gratification, and it completely ruins mate selection. Ury says people date for the prom date. A prom date is someone who looks great in a tuxedo or a dress. They look amazing in pictures. They're super fun at the after party, and you want to hook up with them at the end of the night. But you don't marry your prom date. For a marriage, for a 50-year commitment, you need a life partner. A life partner requires an entirely different set of metrics, and unfortunately, those metrics are rarely flashy in the short term. You need someone who's emotionally stable, someone who's fiercely loyal, someone who knows how to de-escalate a conflict, someone with a growth mindset. As Ury bluntly puts it, you need someone who will sit with you in the oncology ward. When the money runs out, or your health fails, or a pandemic locks you inside your house for a year, the prom date is going to panic and leave. Because the party stopped, the life partner is going to hold your hand while you get chemo. But because of present bias, we consistently optimize for the short-term excitement of the prom date instead of the long-term resilience of the life partner. Which brings us to what happens once you're actually inside a relationship, trying to navigate the shift from the prom to the oncology ward, the maintenance phase. Ury categorizes people who struggle to maintain relationships into two distinct camps, ditchers and hitchers. Let's look at ditchers first. Ditchers are the people who consistently bail on relationships right around the 3 to 6 month mark. Ditchers fall victim to a cognitive trap that Amos Tversky called the transition rule. This rule states that human beings constantly confuse the act of transitioning into a new state with the actual experience of being in that state long term. Like winning the lottery, we think being rich feels like the exact moment they hand you the giant novelty check and the confetti falls. But 10 years later, you're not popping champagne every morning. You're just paying higher taxes and arguing with contractors. In romance, ditchers confuse the chaotic, intense chemical act of falling in love with the calm, stable state of being in love. Falling versus being. Falling in love is a biochemical rush of dopamine and oxytocin designed by evolution to ensure mating. It's intoxicating, but it's also exhausting and biologically unsustainable. Your body cannot maintain that level of chemical arousal forever. It would literally kill you. Being in love is a deeper, quieter, more practical state of partnership. But when the initial high inevitably fades at the 6-month mark, the ditcher interprets that totally normal, healthy transition as a sign the relationship is dead. They think, well, the spark is gone, this must be the wrong person, so they jump ship to chase a new high with someone else. They're addicted to the opening credits and never stay for the actual movie. Then on the flip side, there are the hitchers. The hitchers are the people who stay way past a relationship's expiration date. We all have that friend who's been complaining about their miserable relationship for 4 years but refuses to leave. Hitchers are trapped by two incredibly powerful psychological forces that keep them paralyzed in bad situations. The first is the sunk cost fallacy. I've already put 5 years into this. They look back and think, I've already put 5 years of my life, my youth, my energy into this person. If I leave now, all that time is wasted. They're throwing good time after bad time, just like someone refusing to leave a terrible movie halfway through because they already paid $15 for the ticket. The money's gone, the time's gone, but they stay anyway. The second force keeping them there is loss aversion. This is one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics. Humans feel the psychological pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as we feel the potential joy of gaining something of equal value. Losing $100 hurts far more than finding $100 feels good. So for the hitcher, the immediate agonizing pain of losing their partner, dividing up the friend group, moving out, being alone, feels overwhelmingly worse than the abstract potential joy of finding a better, healthier relationship in the future. This raises an important question for anyone listening who might be in a relationship they're unsure about right now. Are you staying because you're actively building something meaningful with a life partner? Or are you staying because you're terrified of the ambiguity of leaving? Because you have to remember, choosing not to leave is still making a choice. You're actively choosing the status quo every single day you stay. So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and recap, because we've covered a massive amount of behavioral terrain today. The fundamental takeaway is this. The systems you're relying on, both internal and external, are actively sabotaging your search for love. You're trapped in your tendency, whether you're a maximizer endlessly searching for a mathematical impossibility, a romanticizer waiting for a fairy tale that doesn't exist, or a hesitator paralyzed by your own perceived inadequacies. The dating apps are not neutral matchmakers. They're algorithmic casinos, actively exploiting your cognitive biases using variable rewards and evaluability metrics. And once you finally meet someone, you're letting psychological flaws like choice overload, present bias, and the sunk cost fallacy dictate your future. But awareness is the first and most vital step toward behavioral change. The goal, as we've seen through the research, isn't to find the perfect partner. The perfect partner does not exist. The goal is to make a series of good, intentional decisions that build a great relationship. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Think about the entire architecture of modern dating we just dissected. We use these apps, these curated profiles, these rigid distance and height filters to try and eliminate all the friction from meeting someone. We want the process to be seamless, perfectly matched, mathematically optimized, and entirely awkward-free. Before we even say hello, we want a guarantee before we risk anything. But what if that very friction, the messy, unquantifiable, unpredictable friction of two flawed humans colliding in the real world without a predetermined dataset, isn't a barrier to love? What if that friction is the only thing that actually generates the spark? So do yourself a favor today. Delete the apps for a while. Close the spreadsheets, stop maximizing, and go embrace the friction.